Hey guys, welcome to Man Medicine, where we talk about how men can optimize their health and escape the collapsing U.S. healthcare system. Okay, welcome to the next deep dive. This is probably going to be a two-parter, maybe a three-parter, honestly. We're going to talk about GLP-1 agonists. I think this is a really important topic because these drugs have taken the diabetes world, the cardiovascular disease world, and the obesity world by storm since they've come out, and they've become wildly popular. And I think that a lot of folks that prescribe these drugs maybe don't understand how they really work. And certainly a lot of people that take these drugs don't understand how they work. And quite frankly, I think that, at least in my opinion, at least in terms of folks using them for weight loss, I think they're often prescribed, not maybe not inappropriately, but incorrectly, without the sort of support system and uh, additional help that patients need when they take drugs like this. So this is going to be a deep dive into the physiology of these drugs, and we're going to get down into the nitty gritty. These deep dives, as I've mentioned before, are they're a little higher level than my typical contact. I'm trying to give you content in these that are, roughly around the medical school level. So I'm going to assume a certain level of knowledge in basic physiology, in pathology, medical physiology. So don't feel bad if you don't have that background. It's okay. This might prompt you to have to look up a few things, but hey, that's okay. That's how you learn. So, okay. With that said, let's take a deep dive. Okay, so as I mentioned, these drugs are super popular, and when word got out that a whole bunch of these Hollywood, celebrities and other, people that were well known in the public eye, sports figures, etc., were taking these drugs to lose weight, the interest in them for their weight loss properties skyrocketed. There was already a lot of interest in the physician community for using these drugs for type 2 diabetes, and we're going to talk extensively about that. But it was the weight loss properties of these drugs that have caused them to just explode, and for the demand to just go through the roof, despite the kind of ridiculous high cost of at least the big pharma versions, which I'll share with you later. So guys like Charles Barkley's on record as using Ozempic, and I think he said he lost like 60, 70 pounds. Elon Musk has a whole bunch of female celebrities as well. So these drugs are now like firmly in the public's eye, and I get asked about them all the time. I do prescribe them, but I do them in a way that I think is appropriate, and I don't just leave my patients hanging when I prescribe them. They're part of and in my opinion, need to be part of a very comprehensive plan to lose weight if you're going to use them for that reason. So what are we going to do? At least in this part one. We're gonna talk just mainly about like what is GLP-1. So we're gonna talk about the physiology of GLP-1 because I think you have to understand what that is before you can get a handle on how these drugs work, how they're different from actual GLP-1 that your body makes. And so once we have that kind of a base, then we'll understand like why these drugs are so effective, why they have the side effects that they do, etc. And I want to talk a little bit about the history of the drugs and how they were discovered, because it's actually kind of an interesting story that you might be surprised where the first GLP-1 agonist actually came from. So it's kind of cool. So this first part that I'm going to discuss with you guys, which is the physiology of the GLP-1 molecule itself. A lot of this information comes from this really excellent article. It's called Physiology of Pro-Glucagon Peptides, Role of Glucagon and GLP-1 in Health and Disease. It's from Physiology Reviews 2015. Really good article. It has some great diagrams in it that I'm going to show you guys. So GLP-1, it ultimately begins as this very large peptide molecule called pre-proglucagon. Now, pre-proglucagon is broken down into something called proglucagon. And proglucagon contains within its structure a whole bunch of these incretin peptides, which have a whole bunch of variety, different effects, like throughout the body, and they're really fascinating. And so, depending on where in the body proglucagon is, it can be broken down slightly differently. And as you can see, this is a really good article, or this is a really good diagram from that article. If proglucagon is in the alpha cells, it is broken down by this. There's two enzymes. They're both called prohormone convertase is what it's called, and there's prohormone convertase 1,3, and there's prohormone convertase number 2, and they vary in concentrations. Whether you look in the CNS and the bowel, or you look at the alpha cells of the pancreas. Now, they're present in both. It's just like, for example, in the alpha cells, the prohormone convertase number 2 is more prominent. Okay, and so what the number 2 variation of that enzyme does is it gets a hold of proglucagon, and it liberates primarily these 3 molecules here: glucagon, GRPP, which is glycetin-related pancreatic peptide, and then the smaller one called intervening peptide. And then it liberates these what's called major glucagon fragments, which do contain GLP-1 and GLP-2, which is what we're going to be talking about today. So those can further be broken down, and so you can still get like GLP-1 and GLP-2 from these alpha cells, but mainly you get these 3 guys here: glucagon, GRPP, and IP1. And unfortunately, I don't have time to go into all of these. That would just be like part 8 to this deep dive. But we're going to focus mainly on GLP-1, just because that's the one that people are interested in. But just keep in mind, I mean, these gut incretins, which we're really just learning about, are fascinating. They have wide-ranging effects. We think of them mainly as operating in the gut, but as we're going to talk about in these deep dives, the GLP-1 molecule itself exerts effects all over the body. And in my opinion, the gut effects they're pretty interesting, but it's the other effects, I think, they're even more interesting than those. And I think they have a lot of therapeutic potential. So anyway, getting back to the prohormone convertase. So when proglucagon when it enters the CNS and in the gut, that's when this 1,3 variant of the enzyme predominates. And that's when you get immediate release of GLP-1, GLP-2, and then you can see these other, fragments are also released. This one, oxyntomodulin is how it's pronounced. Again, we don't have time to go into that. This one is kind of interesting because it also binds to the GLP-1 receptor, and I think this is going to be one that Big Pharma is going to look at as like maybe one of the next blockbuster weight drugs or weight control drugs, because it does seem to have those properties maybe. So stay tuned for that one. And then, as you can see here, it gets broken down into other fragments here. Glycentin, which again contains glucagon, so you can get glucagon, through this pathway as well. GRPP as well. So, but this is where it comes from. It's pre-proglucagon down to proglucagon, and then these convertase enzymes get a hold of this, and they chop it up into all of its different fragments, and then they go out, throughout the body and exert all their effects. So now we are mainly going to be talking about GLP-1 here almost exclusively, but you saw there's also a GLP-2. So I just want to touch on that, just briefly. And GLP-2, I think, is less well understood. It promotes intestinal cell growth. It definitely it helps with nutrient metabolism within the gut. It seems to help with absorption of fluids and nutrients into the gut. And so it increases blood flow to the gut, increases blood flow through the portal system, which obviously involves the liver. So there actually is a GLP-1 derived peptide that's used in the medical world. It's something called GATTEX is GATTEX is the brand name. It's teduglutide, and apparently, I've actually I've never heard of this. I've never seen it used, but it does exist, and it seems to be helpful for people with something called short gut syndrome. If they've had a major bowel resection, obviously nutrient absorption is a major issue for those people. People with severe Crohn's disease also can have major issues with nutrient absorption. People undergoing like really intense cancer chemotherapies and whatnot. So this particular GLP-2 agonist can be helpful for them just to maintain nutrition through the gut, and maybe prevent them from having to get TPN, which is parenteral IV nutrition, which has a whole host of other problems. So that's GLP-2. We're not gonna touch on that in this deep dive, but just so you're aware, it is out there. Um, we typically think of GLP-1 as being secreted when in response to a meal, and that obviously is true. Um, but you always have basal levels of GLP-1 and GLP-2 for that matter that are being secreted. So it doesn't matter if you're fasting, even at night, you're going to have a steady state amount of GLP-1 and GLP-2, and then boom, as soon as you eat a meal, that's when you get this spike, in both GLP-1 and in GLP-2. Okay, so this is what GLP-1 looks like. So this is a 3D model here, and then this is all the amino acids kind of laid out in order, secreted from the L cells and also the alpha cells in the pancreas. Now this isn't really that important, but there's two little versions of this that have very similar biological activity. One is the GLP-1, they call it GLP-1 736, and then there's GLP-1 737. So really not of much. That's just sort of like gee whiz knowledge that you can bust out at a cocktail party, but it doesn't really have much clinical relevance as far as I'm aware. What I'll also point out to you is that with this GLP molecule, there's two ends, right? So there's an N terminus and a C terminus, and those two bind to separate areas on the GLP-1 receptor, which I'll show you guys here in just a second. Okay, so the interesting thing about GLP-1, as it was learned what it does, it was, I think a lot of researchers immediately recognized that, gosh, wow, if we could give somebody GLP-1, maybe we can get a therapeutic effect here, and it has, potential obviously for treatment of type 2 diabetes and, maybe other conditions as well. The problem is GLP-1 doesn't stick around very long. So it gets broken down really quickly. It has a half-life of like 2 minutes. Okay, and then there's this other molecule. It's called GIP, which is glucose-dependent insulin-trophic peptide. So that's another one that has some similar properties to GLP-1, and that also has a very short half-life. It's also very important for glucose control in type 2 diabetics. So the interesting thing about GIP is that it's broken down much more quickly in people with type 2 diabetes, which obviously compromises their glucose control. But here's the thing: the reason GLP-1 doesn't stick around very long is because there's an enzyme called DPP-4 that comes along, and it just chops it up and cleaves it, and it renders it inactive. So it comes in very quickly. So when scientists figured that out, they thought, okay, well, what can we do to keep GLP-1 around a little bit longer? And then that spawned the creation of a whole class of diabetic drugs called DPP-4 inhibitors, and they come in and they block the DPP-4 enzyme. So what's going to happen? Your endogenous GLP-1 levels will rise, and the GLP-1 that you do create is going to stick around a lot longer. Okay, so you're going to stimulate insulin release. We'll talk about exactly what GLP-1 does. You inhibit glucagon release, and then the net effect of that, they were hoping, is that okay, you're going to lower blood glucose levels. You get better glycemic control. You're going to bring down hemoglobin A1C, et cetera, with these new DPP-4 inhibitors. And yeah, that's exactly what happens. Okay, so the DPP-4 enzyme, it comes along and it cleaves. Yeah, it's an alanine at right here at position 9, where it comes in, and that's where it renders it inactive. So, by the way, like GIP and GLP-2 also have the exact same little alanine area where DPP-4 comes in. So it also cleaves those. So it's pretty important, a pretty important enzyme. So in addition to drugs to inhibit DPP-4, people, scientists were looking at ways like, oh, how can we modify? Maybe we can modify GLP-1 and make it resistant to DPP-4. Okay, and that's kind of the start of the story for these GLP-1 agonists, because they are largely resistant to DPP-4, which is why they stick around for so long. And you're going to be surprised to see where they first found or where they derived the first GLP-1 agonists. It's kind of yeah, it's interesting. So, but anyway, that's how DPP-4 inhibitors work. And those of you with diabetes, or if you have family members with diabetes, you might be familiar with these drugs. Okay, so they're called the gliptins. So their generic names all end with gliptin. The brand names are, there's like Januvia, Onglyza, Tregenda. There's a whole bunch of them. Sitagliptin is Januvia, and these work. They work pretty well. Like you'll drop about 0.4 to 0.7% on average from your hemoglobin A1C if you take one of these drugs, but they don't have the wow factor that the GLP-1 agonists do in terms of weight loss. They don't have the cardiovascular benefits that we'll talk about that the GLP-1s have. So they're not bad. They're really not appropriate for monotherapy, but they synergize pretty well with metformin. So before the GLP-1s were really like widely available and on some of the formulators that I was associated with, like I would use these with like as second line with metformin, or sometimes I would just start them both at the same time because there's some good synergy there. They're pretty well tolerated. They don't have a huge, like a really bad side effect profile. They're actually pretty good. Okay, moving on. So how does GLP-1 work? So this information is going to come from this also excellent journal called Cell Metabolism: Mechanism of Action and Therapeutic Application of Glucagon-like Peptide 1. So this is from 2018. We didn't really know any of this stuff when I was in medical school, but the gut is such an important endocrine organ. It's really fascinating, and we really didn't have any idea of just how important that was when I was coming up, in the late 90s. But now it's becoming obvious that it's super important. So GLP-1s, they augment insulin secretion. They do it in kind of in a dose-dependent fashion. They inhibit glucagon. So, the net effect of that obviously is to lower blood sugar, especially like postprandially. And, the nice thing is they have really low incidence of hypoglycemia, which is always a major issue with many type 2 diabetes drugs, especially the old ones that I grew up with, like the sulfonylureas, et cetera, which was one of the few options that we had back in the day for oral anti-hypoglycemics. They're just like much, much safer. So, through a variety of mechanisms that we'll eventually get into, not only do they curb these, big glucose excursions, after a meal, but they slow gastric emptying. So you stay full for longer, which is, one of several reasons why people tend to lose weight on these. And so, the added benefit of that is that, as food is moving more slowly through the gut, you potentially have more nutrient absorption. So you're absorbing more of the nutrients in the food because it's not flying through your bowel like it would normally. It takes a little bit longer. So it's got more exposure time to all those cells that can extract the nutrients, out of the food. So that's, you get a little bit more bang for your buck, I guess, from your meal. Now, this is an little interesting chart here, and it's a little bit of preview of what we'll talk about in the part 2 to this. But as I alluded to, the gut effects of GLP-1s are pretty interesting, but again, this substance acts throughout the body. So it acts in the CNS, it acts in the liver, it acts in cardiac muscle, it acts in skeletal muscle and smooth muscle. It affects potentially the electrical conduction of the heart. And there's now some really interesting, relatively new studies showing that it can, lower the risk of cardiac events, so and potentially slow atherosclerosis. So, this is not just a gut peptide like we originally thought. It has like really wide-ranging effects. So, just to run through these real quickly. So, the pancreas is, again, major site of action, obviously. So, as I mentioned, stimulates insulin secretion and inhibits glucagon. So, super important there. Um, it actually stimulates pancreatic cell uh, survival and production. So it actually can stop the apoptosis of beta cells, which is, the loss of beta cells as time goes on, as your pancreas kind of burns out in type 2 diabetes, is a major problem. And it's actually one of the major reasons why people with type 2 diabetes, eventually a lot of them end up on insulin because, initially they are hypersecreting insulin. They have, elevated fasting insulin levels. So the pancreas is really working hard. But as they start to lose beta cells, eventually they can't continue to produce the amount of insulin that they need, and a lot of them end up requiring insulin several years to decades like into their disease, and that's obviously not a good thing. So there's some thought that GLP-1 agonists might help keep these poor little beta cells going, keep them alive, and improve their survival. So that's super important. In the CNS, I think we're really just scratching the surface on this, but they seem to affect satiety. They affect food cravings, and we'll talk about some of the mechanisms there. There seem to be some potential in terms of perhaps treating Alzheimer's disease, through modulation of chronic inflammation, which again we'll talk about that a little bit. There's not a lot that's known about that yet, but there seems to be something there about that. It seems to help neuronal cell survival, so helps you keep your neurons alive and healthy. Seems to stimulate learning and memory, at least maybe in animal models. So time will tell if that actually pans out in humans. So super super interesting effects from these drugs, far away from the gut. It's going to be interesting. I think as we learn more about these drugs, we'll get a better idea of what other conditions, maybe perhaps besides type 2 diabetes, they can be helpful for. So stay tuned for that one. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about this. So again, here's our pro-glucagon peptide here, kind of spaced out, and the GLP-1. There's the GLP, the 737 and the 736 versions that I mentioned. So this is just to give you an idea. I thought this was a good little diagram. There are GLP-1 receptors in all of these different cells, which are scattered throughout the entire body. Okay, so lymphocytes. So this little guy here, this purple one here, that's an intraepithelial lymphocyte. So a huge part of your immune system resides within your gut. Those have GLP-1 receptors on them as well. So you can influence the gut, the immune system in the gut. Neurons, we mentioned the CNS. These acinar cells, especially like the pancreatic acinar cells, acinar cells are like the functional unit of the exocrine pancreas. So they dispense all of the digestive enzymes, into the gut to help you to digest your food. So there's effects there. The Brunner's glands, which are in the duodenum, the Brunner's glands, if you remember from your physiology, they help keep the duodenum alkaline. So as this big acidic bolus like comes out of the stomach, where it doesn't do any damage, if things stay really acidic in the duodenum, it can damage the epithelium of the duodenum. So the Brunner cells sort of deactivate that the acidity there, and they raise the pH, and they help those little cells in the duodenum survive, and can prevent you from getting like a duodenal ulcer and things like that. So those have GLP-1 agonists. Sinoatrial node cells. Well, where's the sinoatrial node? That's in your heart, right? So there's some influence on heart rate, and again, we'll talk about that. It's not a huge one, but you'll hear people talk about there's multiple cardiac effects from these drugs. So super super interesting. I mentioned the islet cells, endothelial cells here, vascular smooth muscle major effects there. And then these enteroendocrine cells, which I kind of touched on, earlier, that secrete all of these other incretins. All of these have GLP-1 receptors on them. All of them are influenced not only by native GLP-1, but also by these GLP-1 agonist drugs that of which there are many. And we'll go through all the drugs, as time goes on here. Okay, this is an example here, another like neat little diagram. So over here on the right, you see your in the red, that's your little GLP-1. As you mentioned, it goes down here, it binds on the beta cell. So there's a GLP-1 receptor there, increases insulin biosynthesis. So it actually like upregulates the ribosomes that produce insulin within the cell. And as I mentioned, it decreases apoptosis, right, which is cell death. So you can hold on to your beta cells longer. And we'll see if this actually pans out, but I did see a study. I didn't include it in here, but I think this is potentially really interesting that even in type 1 diabetics, there's maybe some data that these GLP-1 agonists can help type 1 diabetics, which is typically, that's typically thought of as it's autoimmune destruction of the beta cells. It might help preserve beta cell function, maybe keep those guys alive a little bit longer. I think we got a ways to go before we can say that, definitively, but wouldn't that be interesting? So, this is a drug for type 2 diabetes, but who knows, maybe in the next few years we'll see it used in certain people that have type 1, which would be great because type 1 is rough. Okay, so that's the beta cell. And then up here in these, the delta cells here, so when GLP-1, when it binds onto the GLP-1 receptor in these delta cells, you secrete something called somatostatin. Somatostatin comes along and it binds onto the alpha cell. So it binds onto the somatostatin 2 receptor, and that's what decreases glucagon. Okay, this is kind of just to show you mechanistically what happens. Okay, so here's the GLP-1 receptor. This is kind of what it looks like here. And as you can see, there's two sections to this. It spans the lipid bilayer here. It spans the cell wall. Okay, so there's a large hydrophilic. Well, there's two hydrophilic components. Obviously the one that's sticking out of the cell here, and then on the inside of the cell, and then obviously there's a hydrophobic component here that's buried within that lipid bilayer. And again, this comes from chromosome 6, at least in humans. Now, the interesting thing, not to divert too much, but the GLP-1 and the GLP-1 receptor they're present in almost not all life on Earth, but I mean, it is preserved it's in mammals, it's in reptiles, it's in birds. So it's thought that this whole system evolved, they said, at least 700 million years ago, and it's so important and so crucial for all of these different types of animals that it's been largely preserved. There's obviously differences, but the basic function and the basic structure of not only the receptor but of GLP-1 it's very, very similar between humans, reptiles, birds, etc. So just another little fun fact. Okay. So again, I mentioned there's the two domains here of this GLP-1 receptor, one outside of the cell and then one inside of the cell. And this is relevant. Remember I mentioned the N and the C terminus of the GLP-1. So the extracellular component here, so that binds the C terminus down at the bottom, and then this portion here that's on the inside of the cell binds the N terminus. So it actually, the GLP-1 spans the membrane as it is attached to this GLP-1. So very, very interesting. Okay, so this is the story of how we got these GLP-1 drugs. So super fascinating. So they were looking, a lot of times when we're looking for a new drug, it's very helpful to look out into nature, because whether it's a plant or an animal, Mother Nature's pretty smart, and there's likely to be something out there that can that can be helpful. And in this particular case, somebody was studying the Gila monster, okay, otherwise known as Heloderma suspectum. And it turned out that they were looking at the venom of the Gila monster. And the venom of the Gila monster has a lot of different components in it. But one of them is a peptide with an amino acid sequence that's about 53% similar to human GLP-1. It's like, oh, that's pretty interesting. And like a lot of reptiles, the Gila monster can eat like a couple like large meals and then not have to eat for weeks to months afterwards. So there's something within the Gila monster that allows it to do that, and it's likely related to this GLP-1 like molecule, which is also found in the venom. So what they ended up doing is they found the gene, they cloned it, and then they derived this thing. It's called exendin 4 from the saliva, and that's the Gila monster GLP-1. Okay, exendin 4 eventually became the drug exenatide, which we'll talk about, or Byetta, which we'll talk about here in just a second. Okay, now the other just a little more information on Gila monsters in case you were curious. So these are like shy, reclusive creatures, right? They don't go after humans. They live off of like small rodents and rabbits and little mice and stuff like that out in the desert. So, but they have a really nasty bite. And quite frankly, if you get bit by a Gila monster, you probably deserve it because you were messing with this thing. It was not messing with you, you were messing with it. So the Gila monster venom has a number of different properties to it. It has like vasoactive properties, there's high amounts of serotonin in it, but then there's also like a fibrinogen coagulase, which causes a lot of like local tissue destruction. There's case reports of systemic effects too, but mainly you're going to get an extremely painful local reaction with a lot of tissue destruction. Okay, and this is a picture here of what that bite can look like. So with the hand here, this is obviously a fresh bite. You can see where the wound or the area that's been affected by the venom, they've drawn a line around it. We do that a lot in the emergency department with things like with cellulitis, which is skin infection, just to kind of like track the borders of whatever we're looking at. So, this is a very swollen, edematous, puffy hand. And this is just the beginning of what's going to happen to this guy's hand. This picture here, this next one, this is, you can see this is well down the road. This guy has not only, so he's got a big hole missing out of the forearm. So you can see all of that coagulase enzyme in the venom has like eaten away into this guy's tissue. Now there's, you can see where he's gotten a skin graft, right? Because the skin's not going to grow there. All that tissue is dead. And he also has had like, I don't know what they did here. This doesn't look like a fasciotomy scar, but maybe it is. He's obviously had some other procedures done to that forearm. So again, I don't know what the story was here. I guarantee these guys were messing with this Gila monster and they should have just left it alone. And they ended up getting bit. I mentioned that it's mainly a local effect, and that is true. But there are components in this that can cause like some really serious like systemic effects too. So the Gila toxin, they call it, it cleaves angiotensin 1, which then if there's a sufficient amount of that systemically, you need angiotensin 1 as part of the renin-angiotensin system, to maintain blood pressure and whatnot. But if you're cleaving all your angiotensin 1, to potentially, I guess, inactivating it or taking it out of circulation, you can have issues with low blood pressure and hypotension. And this is a case report here of acute myocardial infarction following Gila monster bite. And I believe, if I look at this carefully, this is a very young person. So it was a 23-year-old male herpetologist who should know better. He knows how to handle Gila monsters, but stuff happens. And this guy got really sick and ended up in the hospital and had an MI as a result of the venom. So don't mess with Gila monsters. Leave them alone. Okay. But interestingly enough, this is where GLP-1 comes from. So it's pretty fascinating. So anyway, getting back to diabetics and these GLP-1 agonists, we've known for a long time that diabetics respond abnormally in a number of different ways to a glucose load. Okay, so this chart here shows the insulin response to a meal. So the normal response here is in blue. Okay, so you eat, I don't know, you have a sandwich, you have your turkey sandwich. You're going to get a certain amount of insulin. It's secreted, so you get this nice peak, and then it comes back down. Boom. That's what you should see. Well, a type 2 diabetic, depending on how progressed they are in their disease, though, they're going to have difficulty secreting enough insulin to manage that glucose load, and that's what you see here in the red. Okay, and of course, what's that going to result in? Well, you're going to have a sustained elevation in your postprandial glucose levels. It's going to take longer for that to come down because they're just not able to produce enough insulin, and that is demonstrated here. Plasma glucose concentrations during the 180 minutes after a meal ingestion. You can see here, subjects without diabetes, you get a little bump in your sugar, and then it just kind of flattens out pretty quickly. Definitely by 150 minutes, like, you're right back essentially to where you were. And then here you have your type 2 diabetic, slow, steady rise in glucose. Keeps going up, keeps going up, keeps going up, and then slowly comes down. Okay, and it stays elevated the whole time. Okay, so if we could have a drug that would improve insulin secretion, if we could bump this, on the original graph I showed you, bring that red line up to sort of more closely match the blue line, which is the subject without diabetes, that would be beneficial, right? And then the same with this plasma glucose curve. If we could make that look more like the blue one, that potentially that would be of therapeutic value. Okay. Well, as they started, looking at this Gila monster venom, and then eventually they turned this into a drug that they could sell, and that drug, as I mentioned, was exenatide, otherwise known as Byetta, and it does exactly that. And this was the very first one that came out on the market. It was came out by AstraZeneca, I think, is the company that originally brought it to the market. But it was first synthesized in 1992, actually. But it took that long to come to the market. But when it did, it created a lot of discussion, because in addition to the glucose lowering benefits that we were seeing in patients, they all started losing weight. And they weren't hungry anymore. So that really piqued the interest in, how can we refine this drug? How can we make it work better? Because one of the downsides of Byetta or exenatide is that it's a twice a day injection. So it came in this little auto injector pen here that you see. So it just wasn't as convenient as now we have these long-acting once-a-week formulations of these GLP-1 agonists that work every bit as well, if not better. But Byetta was the first one. I distinctly remember when it came out, and I had a neighbor that started on it, came over and started asking me about it. And at the time, I didn't know very much about it because it was brand new. But this is a direct result of your friendly Gila monster and his venom, and it's a great example of how you can look to Mother Nature and find these naturally occurring substances that sometimes either alone or after modification can be really useful, useful therapeutics for humans. Okay, so Byetta was the first one. This is what we got now. So this is a list of the major ones. This is from GoodRx. So you buy, and these are the brand names. Underneath are the generics. So we're all familiar because of that obnoxious commercial, Ozempic, which is semaglutide. Semaglutide is also known as Rybelsus, also known as Wegovy. We know about Trulicity, Victoza, Saxenda. There's Byetta there, and then Mounjaro is the most effective, arguably, and one of the most interesting. Works slightly differently. So I'll spend a little time discussing Mounjaro separately, at the end of the the second part of this. But Mounjaro, just to cut to the chase, is the one that is associated with the most weight loss, and so that's the one that in the obesity medicine world gets a lot of press and gets a lot of use, and it's the studies are pretty impressive with it. Like almost comparable to, in some cases, to bariatric surgery. So something to consider. It's very expensive, and that brings me to my next slide here. This is the main problem that we're dealing with right now with these drugs. There's obviously very high demand for these drugs, so they are still under patent. But because there is a national shortage, at least for now, compounding pharmacies are able to provide these drugs, and obviously they provide them at a much lower cost. But I was curious what these major brands would cost if you, let's say, you just didn't have insurance, and you want to just do a cash pay for a supply of these drugs. Okay, so I went to GoodRx, which it's a great website, by the way. If you're not familiar with it, you should check it out. But look at these prices, like Wegovy, Trulicity, Saxenda. You're looking at $1,300, $901. Saxenda's $1,302. Ozempic, just over $900. Okay, Victoza's the cheapest at $722. Well, no, nobody can afford that, and so unless you have really good insurance drug coverage, the vast majority of people that can benefit from these medications are not going to be able to have access to them. And this was an article that I found that talks about this, and they're just summarizing a New England Journal article that talked about cost being a major barrier for most people in order to access these drugs. It says sky high costs of SGLT2 inhibitors and GLP-1 agonists deter first line. Not to be off topic, but SGLT2s, I'll probably have to do a deep dive on those two. Fascinating drugs, work totally differently. A good example of a drug that came to market for one indication, but as time went on, was found to be extraordinarily and unexpectedly beneficial in others. Specifically, it came to market to lower blood glucose, but we now know that it has some really impressive cardiovascular disease modifying properties, as well as helpful for people with chronic kidney disease. These drugs are so useful, especially in heart failure, that I actually use them out of the emergency department, which you typically, starting anti-diabetic medications in the emergency department is not something that happens very often, but these drugs are so beneficial, especially with even in acute heart failure, that and because patients can't get admitted in a timely fashion, they're often in my department sometimes for 2 or 3 days before they can get onto the floor, which is where you would typically start a med like this. I'm starting these in the emergency department because of their safety profile and just how effective they are. So anyway, not to go on a tangent on those, but basically this article said that both of these classes of drugs, the prices are going to have to drop by like 70 to 90% in order to make them accessible to the bulk of the people that need them. And so right now that's probably not going to happen anytime soon, unless there's some sort of miracle. I know of 2 individuals that I know personally, friends of our family, that were started on these drugs, did really, really well, and then they lost their insurance coverage, or they switched insurance companies. They wouldn't pay for it anymore, so they had to come off these drugs. And not surprisingly, their blood sugars got worse and they gained weight. So it's pretty unfortunate. Okay, this is one of the last slides I'm going to show you guys here for this deep dive, and I actually really like it because it talks about the 8 core defects in type 2 diabetes, and it just lays them out here. And then it talks about, and it shows right next to it, how these GLP-1 receptor agonists, they address 6 out of the 8. So if you were looking for sort of like the perfect medication to treat some of the fundamental issues with type 2 diabetes, the GLP-1s are getting pretty close. They're getting pretty close, okay? So impaired insulin secretion. Well, we already talked about how they can improve that. There's too much glucagon secretion in type 2 diabetics. Well, we know that GLP-1s help modulate that. They shut it down. They have too much glucose, stored in their liver. Okay, well, it helps with that. Neurotransmitter dysfunction, we'll talk about that when we get to the CNS part. That is one of the fundamental issues with type 2 diabetes, and GLP-1s, they do address that through these satiety and anti-inflammatory mechanisms in the CNS. So stay tuned for that. Okay. the incretin peptides that we talked about, that's all of those, like GLP-1, GLP-2, IP, GIP, all that kind of stuff. Those are dysfunctional. The levels are decreased in type 2 diabetics. So obviously you're giving back one of them, GLP-1. So that can be beneficial as well. So decreased glucose uptake. Okay, you you know, as I mentioned, they slow gastric emptying time, right? So you're going to get more nutrient absorption, and then increased lipolysis. Well, increased insulin uptake in peripheral tissues via weight loss. So that's going to be the fundamental mechanism, honestly, that in my opinion is doing the most good for people. It's the weight loss, because accumulation of visceral adiposity is like, that's, in my opinion, like that's the fundamental problem that leads to type 2 diabetes. People will have a genetic predisposition to this condition, but if they were to stay lean throughout their entire life, the odds of them becoming a type 2 diabetic greatly, greatly reduced, right? But they start accumulating visceral body fat, which, we all do as we get older, then it becomes a spiral. And then, their threshold for the development of type 2 diabetes, because of their genetics, is lower. So, addressing the weight and addressing the visceral body fat and the inflammation that it causes is like one of the core things. Like when I work with my type 2 diabetics, and I have a lot of pre-diabetics, that's what we focus on, because I don't know of any other better way to make it go away than, if you lose 40 pounds of visceral body fat, and let's say you gain 10 to 15 pounds of skeletal muscle, sometimes, man, that's enough. You're no longer diabetic. You're no longer pre-diabetic. And then you don't need these drugs. But these drugs can be very helpful for people, especially right out of the gate. I don't have any problem prescribing them. I have problems charging as much as some of the clinics out there do. I can't sleep at night if I were to charge what they do. So I try to keep the prices down on these in my practice, because I think they can be life-changing drugs for some people. So that's all I'm going to leave you with today, guys. We're going to go even deeper into these drugs on part 2 of this. So we're going to talk about the CNS, the brain effects of GLP-1 agonists, which I think are fascinating. We're going to talk about the cardiovascular effects. We're going to talk about skeletal muscle, which is near and dear to my heart. And we're not going to talk that much about the gut effects, but we'll touch on those too. And then I want to give you guys some comparisons, so you can, all of these work in roughly the same way, but some are associated with more weight loss than others. Some of them have contraindications that others don't. And we're going to talk about side effects and some potential risks and dangers like cancer. So, because you need to know about all that stuff if you're going to take these drugs, and you certainly need to know about it if you're going to prescribe them. So, okay. And then finally, what I'll mention to you guys is my approach when I prescribe these to a patient. Ultimately, I only want to have to prescribe them for a short period of time. And then I don't ever want them to have to need them again. Well, if you lose a lot of weight and then you lose a lot of skeletal muscle tissue, and then, you tend to rebound anytime you have dramatic amounts of weight loss. And that's one of the things that can set people up for failure with these drugs, is they lose too much skeletal muscle mass. And, I place the blame for that directly on the prescribing provider, because they didn't provide the proper nutritional counseling and guidance. But they are handing these drugs out like candy, and they're making a fortune off of them. So just the way it is, guys. Okay, I hope you like that. If you have experience with these drugs, if you want me to touch on any specific issues about them in the next part 2 of this, please let me know. I think these are really, really interesting drugs, and we're going to talk about them a lot on this channel in the future. All right. Take care, guys. I'll talk to you next time.
And medicine video and audio has been created and shared online for informational purposes only. This podcast does not constitute the practice of medicine or professional healthcare services of any kind, including the giving of medical advice. I am not your doctor. No doctor-patient relationship has been established. This content is not meant to be a substitute for professional medical advice and should not be relied upon solely for that purpose either. The only purpose of this content is to present peer-reviewed, research-backed health information for your consideration. As always, rely on the advice and guidance of your personal physician before undertaking any activity presented here, and if in doubt or not comfortable with said activity, practice discretion. Your health is your responsibility and not ours. Finally, I take conflicts of interest seriously. I accept no compensation whatsoever from any private corporations, including pharmaceutical or supplement companies. You can trust that if I recommend a medication, product, or service, it's because I genuinely believe in it and not because I'm being paid to endorse it.